You know the moment when you realize something's wrong. It's not always dramatic. No thrown plates, no screaming matches that wake the neighbors. Sometimes it's quieter than that. It's the subtle tightening in your chest when you hear their key in the door. It's the way you've started rehearsing conversations in your head, trying to predict which version of them you'll get today. It's the strange feeling of walking on eggshells in what's supposed to be your safe place. And yet, you stay. If you've ever been in a toxic relationship or watched someone you love struggle in one, you know this contradiction intimately. From the outside, it seems simple. If something hurts you, you leave. But from the inside, it's a labyrinth of conflicting emotions, distorted perceptions, and invisible chains that feel heavier than any physical restraint. The question that echoes through the minds of friends, family members, and even the people themselves is always the same. Why do they stay? The answer is far more complex than weakness or stupidity or any of the other dismissive explanations people offer. The psychology of staying in toxic relationships reveals something profound about human nature, about how our brains process love, danger, hope, and identity. It shows us how the very mechanisms designed to protect us can sometimes trap us instead. Most toxic relationships don't start toxic. They begin with something intoxicating, an intensity that feels like destiny, a connection that seems to see right through you. The early days are often characterized by what psychologists call love bombing, excessive attention, constant communication, grand gestures that make you feel like the center of someone's universe. Your brain during this phase is essentially throwing a chemical party. Dopamine floods your system, creating feelings of euphoria and pleasure. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, makes you feel deeply attached. Serotonin levels actually drop, which is why you can't stop thinking about them. It's the same neurochemical pattern seen in obsessive-compulsive disorder. You're not just falling in love, you're becoming chemically dependent on the feeling. This is crucial to understanding why people stay, because this initial phase creates a powerful baseline. When someone asks, "Why don't you just leave?" what they're really asking you to abandon is not just the current painful reality, but the memory of when everything felt magical. Your brain has recorded that feeling, cataloged it, and now uses it as evidence that the relationship can return to that state, that the person you fell for is still in there somewhere. The shift from healthy to toxic rarely happens overnight. It's gradual, almost imperceptible, like the way you don't notice your hair growing until suddenly it needs cutting. First, it's a comment about your outfit that feels slightly off. Then it's a joke at your expense in front of friends. Then it's questioning why you need to see your family so often. Then it's checking your phone. Each boundary crossed is just small enough that calling it out feels like an overreaction. This gradual erosion is psychologically brilliant in its cruelty because it exploits something called the boiling frog phenomenon. Just as a frog placed in slowly heating water won't jump out because the temperature change is too gradual to trigger alarm, people in relationships that slowly become toxic often don't recognize the danger because there's no single moment where everything clearly changed. What's happening in your mind during this phase is a constant recalibration of what's acceptable. Psychologists call this normalcy bias, the tendency to believe that things will continue functioning as they normally have, even in the face of crisis. Your brain is constantly trying to make sense of your environment, and when reality conflicts with your expectations, it's often easier to adjust your expectations than to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth. You start making small justifications. They're just stressed about work. Everyone has bad days. I probably was too sensitive. Each justification is like a small stone added to a scale, and you don't realize how heavy the weight has become until you're already struggling to carry it. Here's where the psychology gets particularly insidious. If a toxic relationship were consistently terrible, leaving would be easier. But toxic relationships rarely work that way. Instead, they operate on what behavioral psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, a pattern of unpredictable rewards that is, ironically, one of the most powerful tools for maintaining behavior. Think about slot machines. They're designed using intermittent reinforcement. You don't win every time, but you win just enough and unpredictably enough that you keep pulling the lever. Your brain becomes hyper-focused on the reward, constantly chasing that high, unable to predict when it will come, but convinced that it's just around the corner. In a toxic relationship, this looks like cycles of abuse followed by periods of kindness, affection, or that familiar intensity from the early days. They hurt you, and then they're sweet again. They criticize you, and then they surprise you with a thoughtful gesture. They withdraw emotionally, and then they open up in a moment of vulnerability that reminds you why you fell for them. These good moments, these glimpses of the person you fell in love with, become more powerful than consistent goodness would ever be. Research shows that intermittent reinforcement creates stronger behavioral patterns than continuous reinforcement. The unpredictability keeps you emotionally invested in a way that stability never could. You're not just staying for who they are, you're staying for who they might be again, in the next moment, or the next day, or after they work through their issues. Your brain starts to focus obsessively on these positive moments, cataloging them as evidence that things can get better, that this is the real person and the toxicity is just a phase. You become hypervigilant, constantly analyzing their mood, trying to figure out what triggers the good version versus the bad version, convinced that if you can just crack the code, you can have the relationship you want. Perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of toxic relationships is how trauma can actually strengthen your attachment to someone. This is called trauma bonding, and it explains why some people feel most connected to their partner during or after the worst moments. Trauma bonding occurs when there are intense emotional experiences, especially involving fear, excitement, and sexual feelings, combined with intermittent good-bad treatment. It's the psychological equivalent of being in a foxhole together. The intensity of the negative experience actually creates a powerful feeling of connection and loyalty. When you're in a state of anxiety or fear because of someone, and then that same person provides comfort or relief from that state, your brain forms an extremely strong association. They become both the source of your pain and your refuge from it. This creates a closed loop where the very person who hurts you is also the only person who can make you feel better, because they're the only one who truly understands what you're going through. You might find yourself defending them to friends and family, not because you're in denial, but because the bond you feel is real, even if it's unhealthy. The intensity of your experiences together, the highs and lows, the conflicts and makeups, can feel more meaningful than stable, peaceful relationships. Some part of your brain has learned to associate love with this particular cocktail of pain and relief, drama and resolution. Over time, something more insidious happens. The constant criticism, the need to manage someone else's emotions, the walking on eggshells, it all slowly erodes your sense of self. You start to lose track of what you think, what you want, who you are, apart from this relationship. Psychologists call this identity foreclosure, when your identity becomes so intertwined with another person or relationship that you can no longer clearly differentiate yourself from them. You've made so many compromises, adjusted your behavior in so many ways, that you're not sure who you'd be without this relationship to define you. The questions that once had clear answers become murky. Do you even like that hobby anymore? Or did you just give it up because it caused arguments? Are those really your opinions? Or have you adopted theirs to keep the peace? Who are your friends now? When was the last time you made a decision without considering how they'd react? This identity erosion makes leaving even more terrifying because you're not just leaving a person. You're facing the prospect of rediscovering or rebuilding yourself. The relationship has become your structure, and without it, you fear you'll collapse. The toxic relationship, despite its pain, provides a strange kind of certainty. You know who you are in relation to them, even if that person isn't who you used to be or want to be. The longer you stay, the harder it becomes to leave, not because the relationship gets better, but because of a cognitive bias called the sunk cost fallacy. This is the tendency to continue investing in something because you've already invested so much, even when the rational choice would be to cut your losses. You think about the years you've given to this relationship, the plans you made together, the dreams you shared, the friends and family who know you as a couple, the photos, the memories, the inside jokes. The thought of all that becoming meaningless, of having wasted all that time, feels unbearable. So you stay, thinking, if I can just make it work, then all this suffering will have meant something. It will have been worth it. The pain you've already endured becomes a reason to endure more pain, in hopes of eventually reaching a payoff that justifies the investment. It's the same mechanism that keeps people pouring money into failing businesses or staying in unfulfilling careers, except the stakes are your emotional well-being and your life. This is compounded by what you've sacrificed to be in the relationship. Maybe you moved to a new city for them. Maybe you gave up opportunities. Maybe you've drifted from friends who tried to warn you. Each sacrifice makes it harder to leave because admitting the relationship isn't working means admitting those sacrifices were for nothing. Hope is usually considered a virtue, but in toxic relationships, it can become an addiction. You become dependent on the idea that things will change, that they'll finally become the person they have the potential to be, that this time will be different. Every apology feeds this hope, every promise to change, every therapy session they agree to attend, every moment of insight where they seem to finally understand how their behavior affects you. These moments are like drops of water in a desert. They keep you going just enough to stay, but they're never quite enough to quench your thirst. The psychological term for this is optimism bias, the tendency to believe that you're less likely to experience negative events than others. You tell yourself that unlike other toxic relationships, yours can be fixed. Unlike other people who stayed too long, you're staying for the right reasons. You're not blind. You just understand them in a way no one else does. You see their potential, their wounded inner child, the person they could be if only they healed. This hope becomes particularly potent when mixed with what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to attribute others' negative behaviors to external circumstances rather than internal character. When they hurt you, you blame their childhood trauma, their stressful job, their mental health struggles, their insecurities. You separate the behavior from the person, always holding on to the belief that the real them is the good version, and the bad version is just circumstances getting in the way. For many people, staying isn't just about love or hope, it's about fear, and not just the fear of being alone or starting over, though those are real. There's a more primal fear that takes hold in toxic relationships, the fear of what might happen if you leave. Sometimes this fear is based on explicit threats. They've told you what they'll do if you try to leave, to themselves, to you, to your children, to your pets, to your career or reputation. Research shows that the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is often the period immediately after someone tries to leave, and anyone who's been explicitly threatened understands this viscerally. But even without explicit threats, there's an ambient fear that develops. You've seen their anger, their irrationality, their capacity to twist reality. You've witnessed how quickly they can turn from loving to cruel. You know the depth of their need for control. The unknown of how they might react to losing that control can feel more terrifying than the known pain of staying. There's also the fear of not being believed. Toxic relationships often involve a public persona that's drastically different from the private reality. They're charming to outsiders, well-liked, maybe even admired. You fear that if you try to explain what happens behind closed doors, people won't believe you. You might not even believe yourself sometimes, because they're so skilled at making you doubt your own perceptions and memories, a tactic psychologists call gaslighting. Perhaps one of the most overlooked reasons people stay in toxic relationships is shame. The shame of admitting you made a mistake. The shame of acknowledging that the relationship everyone thought was so great is actually destroying you. The shame of feeling weak or foolish for not leaving sooner. This shame is often compounded by the judgment, real or perceived, from others. You've heard the questions before, maybe directed at someone else. Why would anyone stay in that situation? I would never put up with that. They must like being treated that way. These judgments, even when not directed at you, teach you that if you reveal your situation, You'll be blamed, pitied, or seen as complicit in your own suffering. So you hide it. You craft a public narrative that everything's fine. You make excuses for their behavior to friends and family. You put on a smile in social situations even though you were crying an hour earlier. This hiding becomes its own trap, because the more you've invested in maintaining the illusion that everything's okay, the harder it becomes to break that illusion and ask for help. The shame is particularly acute because on some level, you know what people will say. The signs were there from the beginning. Your friends tried to warn you. Why didn't you leave after the first time? And maybe they're right. Maybe you did see warning signs. Maybe you did make excuses. Maybe you did stay after you promised yourself you wouldn't. But that awareness doesn't make leaving easier, it makes it harder. Because now, you're not just battling the relationship, you're battling your own self-judgment. Beyond the psychological factors, there are often very real, practical barriers that keep people in toxic relationships. These material constraints interact with the emotional bonds to create a situation where leaving feels not just difficult but impossible. Financial dependence is one of the most common practical barriers. Maybe they control the money. Maybe you gave up your career for the relationship. Maybe you never built your own financial independence. Maybe you have children and you're terrified of not being able to support them on your own. The fear of poverty, of homelessness, of not being able to provide basic necessities. These aren't irrational fears. They're based in the very real understanding of how much life costs and how vulnerable you'd be. There's also the web of logistics, shared leases or mortgages, joint bank accounts, pets you both love, friend groups that would have to be divided, family members who've become intertwined, the sheer exhausting task of untangling your life from someone else's when you're already emotionally depleted. When you're barely surviving day to day, the monumental task of leaving can feel beyond your capacity. For people with children, the calculation becomes even more complex. You worry about the impact of divorce or separation on your kids. You fear losing custody or having to share custody with someone you don't trust. You tell yourself that staying together is better for the children, even as you know they're absorbing the toxic dynamics. The responsibility for other vulnerable lives adds another layer to an already impossibly complex decision. And yet, despite all these powerful forces keeping people in toxic relationships, many eventually leave. The moment when someone finally recognizes the relationship for what it is and decides to leave is different for everyone, but it often shares common elements. Sometimes it's a moment of stark clarity, a single incident that's so egregious you can't rationalize it away. Sometimes it's more gradual, a slow accumulation of awareness that builds until the truth becomes undeniable. Sometimes it's seeing your situation reflected in someone else's story and suddenly recognizing yourself. Sometimes it's the realization that your children are learning that this is what love looks like. Psychologists have found that people often need to attempt to leave multiple times before they succeed, an average of 7 attempts in cases of domestic violence. Each attempt isn't a failure. It's part of the process. You're testing your own strengths, gathering resources, building up your resolve, learning what works and what doesn't. The journey out of a toxic relationship isn't linear. It involves steps forward and steps back, moments of certainty and moments of doubt, grief for what you're losing, even as you recognize it was never really what you thought it was. You might miss them desperately even as you remember why you left. You might question your decision even as you feel yourself slowly coming back to life. Understanding the psychology of why people stay in toxic relationships isn't just an academic exercise. It's the first step towards compassion, both for others and for yourself. If you're in a toxic relationship, understanding these psychological mechanisms can help you see that you're not weak or stupid or broken. You're human, and your brain is responding exactly as evolution designed it to respond to certain patterns of behavior and emotion. If someone you love is in a toxic relationship, understanding these dynamics can help you offer support without judgment, patience without enabling, truth without condemnation. The most helpful thing you can do isn't to repeatedly ask why they stay, but but to consistently remind them of who they are outside of this relationship, to be a stable presence when they're ready to reach out, and to believe them when they tell you their truth. The psychological journey out of a toxic relationship and into recovery is about slowly reclaiming all the things that were eroded: your identity, your boundaries, your trust in your own perceptions, your belief in your worthiness of genuine love. It's about understanding that the intensity you mistook for passion was often just chaos, that drama is not the same as depth, that love shouldn't require you to diminish yourself. It's about learning that you can survive the fear of the unknown, that you're stronger than the years of erosion suggested, that the time invested wasn't wasted because you've learned things about yourself that you could have learned no other way. It's about recognizing that leaving isn't failure. Staying in something that destroys you is the only failure, and even that is understandable, given everything we now know about how these relationships work on the human psyche. The psychology of staying in toxic relationships reveals the beautiful and terrible complexity of human attachment, hope, and survival. It shows us how the very qualities that make us capable of deep love, our capacity for hope, our ability to bond, our desire for consistency, our commitment to promises, can be twisted into chains. But it also shows us that understanding these mechanisms is the first step toward breaking free, toward building something better, toward believing that you deserve a love that doesn't hurt.